What might happen if America went into a modern-day civil war?
This is for educational purposes only. I'm not advocating for anyone to go to war, but this is a distinct possibility that we need to be aware of that could happen given how degraded and divided that we have become. So here's a map of predominantly blue and predominantly red areas. Red being more conservative and blue being more left-wing voters. There are a lot of different factions on both the left and the right. On the right, you have everything from libertarians, independents, Christian nationalists, classical liberals, and the alt-right. The right holds a variety of factions that only have the defining factor today of not being in line with the woke ideology of the left. People on the right can fall anywhere from those who disagree with paying taxes to those who believe in more traditional values to radical Islamic groups like the Taliban. Fiscally speaking, conservative means to conserve government spending as a basic principle, whereas liberal means to liberally spend government money. This is something that tends to be factored in a lot by progressives who believe that if we liberally spend government money on all of these various programs, that life will get better for the people at the bottom. The left has various factions as well, including communist, socialist, Democrats, liberals, feminist, Marxists, the Green Party, social justice activists who are one-issue voters, and when I'm referring to the right and left in America, it has little or nothing to do with the political compass. It has to do with the people who would be more likely to vote Republican or Democrat based on the policies they feel fall most in line with their beliefs. Often our leaders, both Democratic and Republican, fall into similar categories of the political compass, so it's just simply not that accurate of a test. We can see that blue voters are concentrated in and around urban or metropolitan areas, whereas red voters tend to be in more suburban or rural areas. It doesn't mean that the population living in these areas are a monolith. You can have liberals who live out in the country, and you can have conservatives who live in the cities. It just means that more people in these locations tend to vote heavily red or heavily blue. Now, there is obviously a lot more geography making up the red areas, but typically these are areas seen with lower populations given the urban and rural divide in politics, which is something that's actually seen all over the world. Although the left does seem to have control of the culture, the media, and academia, these are not the things that would inherently win a war. The majority of combat military, veterans, and currently serving members lean conservative, which is an important demographic to consider, but let's take the military out of this entirely. Because more than likely, if there is a civil war in America, it would be small factions of militias fighting against one another. And it's important to remember that if we do have a civil war on US soil, not only would we have to suffer the loss of innocence and the loss of human life, but it would also leave us weaker as a country and more exposed to foreign invasion. And nuclear war is always a possibility on the horizon. There are some small militias on the left with firearms training, but they pale in comparison to the sheer amount of gun owners and former combat veterans on the right. Now, if the left managed to pressure the right into starting a revolution, if things just got so crazy that the right got overly emotional and decided to start a revolution, kind of like what happened on January 6th, but they actually did something, then the left would more than likely get the military, and it would probably be over for the right. So it would be wise for people on the right not to get overly emotional or push to their limits. Remember, anytime there's ever been a revolution, those who start the revolution often end up getting killed by their own side. Like in the French Revolution with people like Robespierre, for example. In the end, these people are often seen as being too radical even for their own people. But on top of gun owners being more conservative, having a more conservative military and more conservative combat veterans, almost every agricultural area or area where there's oil drilling leans right. The left also just doesn't have any continuous geography like the right does. Also, a huge fumble on the part of the left in recent years with identity politics is the emasculation and degradation of an entire generation of young men. Especially if they're straight and white, they're automatically put at the bottom of the oppression hierarchy. For sins that they themselves didn't commit, but people that shared their skin tone committed generations ago. That's why we're starting to see so many more young men leaning conservative, whereas young women are leaning even more liberal. But women are not going to be the ones funds to fight a war. I'm sorry, but that's just literally not how it's ever worked, and it's not how it's going to work anytime soon. Other major issues for young men are just how much dating prospects have changed for them in recent years, as well as employment. It's really hard to even get hired, much less move up in a company, if you're not part of their DEI program. 1 in 3 young men report still being virgins by the age of 30, and I have to think that this is a highly underreported statistic. That same demographic of men was only 7% in 1980. Dating apps and creep culture have a lot to do with this. Men are often afraid to simply ask a woman out in public out of fear of being labeled a creep. And I'm seeing a lot more men who are indeed creepy, and it's likely because our society has done such a poor job in socializing people. But when one side offers you nothing but humiliation, it's easy to see how you could get radicalized in the opposite direction. I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad thing, but I can see why it happens. Based on the stats of underemployment, declining mental health, the economy, lower dating prospects, I can see why more young men might be willing to roll the dice for change if shit were to kick off. Which is why every society in history has been more of a patriarchy, because it's easier to placate the young men rather than have them burn the society down. This is such a dangerous thing that our society has done, and it's why I feel like there's not a lot of strategy going on for the left. You really don't want to piss off the fighting age young men. If they have no place in the system, then eventually the system is going to get burnt down. And we can sit here and scream about the patriarchy all day, you can call me a pick-me, but you can only fight human nature for so long. And yes, there are still plenty of young men on the left, but let's be honest with ourselves about whether or not those young men would be willing or able to fight for leftist ideology. The men of the left are typically a bit more effeminate, hence why the ideology resonates with them so much. The left is an ideology that abhors masculinity, and it pretends to abhor violence, but we've all seen the riots that they're capable of. But sanctioned rioting in major cities where most of the people are not gun owners, and if they are, they're not going to be allowed to even fight back, versus actual war, are very different things. One is chaos that is being allowed by the regime. The other is militant destruction of the other side to reach an end goal. So keep this in mind and tell me how well you think the left would be able to fight given the geography that they hold and the typical leftist persona. Are there some more masculine men on the left who would be willing and capable of fighting? Sure. I'm sure there are some because there are plenty of different kinds of people out there. But there are far more conservative men who work in blue-collar fields, who own firearms and have had training or have combat military experience that would outweigh the number of leftists capable of that heavily. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that everyone or everywhere would be entrenched in warfare if civil war were to break out. Chances are the majority of the country would never actually see any fighting, but they could still be affected in different ways. Whether that would be supply chain issues, road closures, or even more breakdown of the economy. The left could also try to hire outside military or mercenaries to fight for them. But more than likely, the majority of these people with combat experience are not going to want to fall in line with leftist ideology, which includes transitioning kids, gender ideology in schools, mass undocumented immigration, racial hierarchies, and everything else that goes into woke ideology, which has been adopted by the Democrats and the left. And it's not that I necessarily believe that the average Democrat believes in all of these things or even agrees with them, but they have allowed it to infiltrate their party so that the people they are pushing forward are pushing this ideology. And it all goes back to academia and the non-government organizations that lobby for the Democrats. I do think that fighting against the anti-woke populace is likely a reason that the left has allowed in so many undocumented immigrants, especially knowing that a good portion of them are criminals and gang members from South America. If there was any strategy to having so many people flooding across the border, it would likely be to give them roles in the military and have them do things that our military might not be willing to do to its own people. And obviously, all of the people who have illegally immigrated to America in recent years are not hardened criminals or gang members. But the peaceful majority stop mattering when crime goes up and when American citizens are getting killed because of bad actors within this population. No one remembers the peaceful majority, they're only going to remember the criminals who terrorize their communities. So overall, unless people on the right get overly emotional and start a rebellion to where the left is able to take the military, I think it would be fairly easy for the right to win a civil war given the population on the right and given the geography that they hold. As cold as I feel saying this, it would be easy to Stalingrad the inner cities. And I hate that I'm even thinking about this for my own country, but it's come to a point where I'm thinking how all of this might play out and where I should be for my own safety. And although I think that the right does have the best chance at winning a civil war, I can also recognize that there's many factions on the right, and after a civil war ended, they would likely all be fighting for dominance. But I think once things calm down, we'd go back to having more moderates in charge, and overall things would get better in the long run. No matter how all of this goes down, I feel like things are going to suck for a while, and I think we've all kind of come to that conclusion. Things are bad, they're going to get worse, and eventually they'll get better. What we really need to worry about even more than a civil war is a nuclear war. Because no matter how bad things get here, no one is going to nuke their own home. I know that's a threat that we've had looming over us for decades now, but something really scary happened with Putin recently. For one, there's been reports that he has cancer, and if it's terminal, he may feel like he has nothing left to lose, especially since he's losing Ukraine. But more disturbing than that is him putting out a PSA for conservative Americans or Europeans who were tired of the neoliberalism in their home countries and wanted to live in a country like Russia with traditional Christian values. He's actually been building a village near Moscow for conservative American expats. This could be interpreted as, hey, we're getting ready to drop some nukes on the rest of the world. For those of you who are more on our side, come over here where you'll be safe. Of course, he's never just going to come out and say that he's ready to drop a nuke on America, but it is really weird that he's asking like-minded people to immigrate to his country. It's either a trap or he's offering an olive branch of safety. I don't know how much you want to put your faith in Putin. Personally, I feel like all of these people cannot be trusted. I don't feel like our own leaders can be trusted, so why would I trust a foreign dictator? I also think that most conservative Americans would feel like their country is worth fighting for. Russia is certainly capable of nuclear war. We know that they have nukes. And in nuclear war, everything dies. There are no more plants. There are no more animals. There's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to go. And sure, the elites and the politicians, they'll be okay in their bunkers, but what about the rest of us? If the initial fallout doesn't kill you, the leftover radiation will. I really think we need to stop sending Ukraine and all of these other countries money, especially while we're in so much debt and while our own economy is hurting so much. But that will likely continue because the left loves to send money to these other countries, and I don't feel like they're going to be giving up their power anytime soon. And they have become the party of war, because they realize there is a lot of money in the military-industrial complex. Everyone sided with Ukraine when the Russia invasion first happened, and I immediately didn't trust this propaganda that was being played to us. Why yes, I feel bad for the Ukrainian citizens that are being affected. I also feel bad for the Russian citizens. I feel bad for the Israelis and the Palestinians that are being affected by all of these senseless wars. There is such a huge cost of human life that our leaders don't seem to grasp. But I don't feel like printing money or sending our tax dollars overseas is really helping anyone. But tell me what you think. Do you feel like we're headed towards a civil war, a revolution, a nuclear war? Because I unfortunately feel like at least one of those is on the horizon. There's too many problems, too many dominoes are beginning to fall at once, and I fear there may be no alternative way out of this.